The storm hit the village with the ferocity of a tempest. By the time the first dark clouds gathered on the horizon, the sun had already slipped below the tree line, leaving only the flickering orange light of distant farmhouses as a contrast to the darkening sky. Winds whipped through the trees, bending their trunks as though trying to uproot them, while sheets of rain lashed against the earth, turning the once dry path into a slippery, treacherous quagmire. Even the hardest, most resilient of creatures would be hard-pressed to survive the force of nature that now descended upon the world. But among the shadows of this storm, one figure moved with purpose, driven by instinct rather than the raging weather around him. Max, an old Labrador retriever, with fur matted by years of exposure to the elements and eyes dimmed by age, padded through the forest. His once proud coat had become patchy, and his gait was slower than it used to be. The years had taken their toll. Once a service dog, now abandoned and forgotten after the passing of his last owner, Max had wandered aimlessly for weeks, without purpose, without care, as the world he had once known seemed to slip further away. He wasn't always alone, though. There was Anna, a kind-hearted nurse. She had been the one to offer him food when he had wandered too close to her porch, his belly aching with hunger. She had given him the scraps from her dinner table, as though understanding the sadness that weighed heavily on his soul. And for that, Max had felt a flicker of hope, something that had been missing from his life for so long. Yet, it was still not enough to replace the bond he had shared with his former owner. That bond was broken, and he was now astray, wandering through a world that seemed indifferent to his existence. But tonight, in the midst of the storm, something changed. Max's ears perked up as a faint sound reached his sensitive hearing. A cry. At first, he thought it was just the wind howling through the trees, playing tricks on him, but no. It was real. A soft, desperate sound, almost too faint to hear over the chaos of the storm. It was a cry of distress, a plea for help that echoed in the night. Max froze, his paws planted firmly in the mud, listening intently. The cry was coming from somewhere nearby, a few paces off the worn path he had been walking. His nose twitched, his instincts stirring. He had been a service dog once, trained to assist, to act with purpose, to serve those in need. He had never been trained for what was happening now, but something inside him told him to move, to find the source of that cry and offer what help he could. With a low growl, he followed the sound, weaving his way through the thick underbrush, pushing aside branches with his broad chest. His paws slipped on the wet earth, and he stumbled more than once, his old body no longer as nimble as it once was. But still, he pressed on. The cries grew louder, and soon Max found himself standing in front of a bush, its branches twisting in the wind like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed through the tangle of leaves and branches. And there, hidden in the shelter of the bush, he saw it. A bundle. It was small, wrapped tightly in what appeared to be a cloth, and the faint cry was coming from within. Max's heart skipped a beat. He nudged the bundle with his nose, cautiously at first, then with more urgency as he felt the warmth of a tiny body inside the cloth. He could feel the faint pulse of life, but it was weak, fragile. The baby was alive, but just barely. Max's instincts kicked in. He was no longer the old service dog, abandoned and forgotten. He was a protector, and this tiny life needed saving. The rain continued to fall, the wind howling around him, but Max paid it no mind. He gently picked up the bundle in his mouth, his jaw holding it carefully as he began to move, navigating through the thick undergrowth, his mind set on one goal: getting the baby to safety. As he moved, the world around him seemed to blur, the storm intensifying with every step he took. His body ached with every movement, his legs trembling with exhaustion, but he kept going. He had to. He could feel the tiny heart beating against his own, fragile like a bird's fluttering wings in a storm. The path to Anna's house was long, longer than it had ever seemed before. The wind picked up, and the trees began to sway dangerously, their branches creaking in protest. Max's muscles burned with every step, and the rain stung his eyes. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the edge of the forest, and Anna's house came into view. A small, modest cabin that had always seemed like a safe haven to him. It was dark inside, the lights out, but that didn't matter. He had made it. With a final effort, Max staggered onto the porch, collapsing in exhaustion as he gently set the bundle down on the wooden steps. He lifted his head and barked, the sound ragged and weak, but loud enough to break through the stillness of the night. Max's bark echoed into the storm, a cry for help of his own, and as the sound faded into the distance, he collapsed onto the porch, his eyes closing, knowing that he had done what he could. The storm outside raged with a fury that seemed to match the disquiet brewing inside Anna's heart. She stood by the window, watching the thick sheets of rain blur the world outside, turning the trees into nothing more than dark silhouettes, their trunks twisting and creaking under the battering wind. It wasn't the first storm of the season, but it was certainly the harshest, a reminder of the harshness of nature that mirrored the loneliness she sometimes felt living on the edge of the village. Her cabin, tucked away from the bustle of the town, had always been a sanctuary of sorts. But tonight, there was a deep sense of unease that she couldn't shake. A strange sound pierced through the chaos of the storm, the sound of a dog's bark, sharp and urgent. Anna froze, her hand still resting on the windowpane. It wasn't the usual barking she heard when Max came by, asking for scraps or a scratch behind the ears. This bark was different, desperate almost. It seemed to be calling out, as though it were a cry for help in the midst of the storm. Max had always been an outsider, the old Labrador retriever who wandered the woods with little purpose, his coat dull and matted from his years on the streets. He had once been a service dog, but when his owner passed away, no one came to claim him. Anna had noticed him a few times, wandering by her cabin, looking for food or a bit of companionship. Every time, she'd offer him a meal, and he'd accept with quiet gratitude, but neither of them ever spoke. He was a silent, solitary figure, just like her. So when the barking broke through the silence of her house, something in Anna stirred. She hurried to the door, throwing on her coat over her flannel shirt, not caring that the wind was howling outside. The rain had intensified, and the earth seemed to tremble under the storm's force. Anna stepped onto the porch, calling out into the howling night, "Max? Is that you?" The wind howled louder in response, but the bark came again, closer this time. A sense of urgency filled her chest as she stepped down from the porch, her boots sinking into the mud with each step. The yard was barely visible, swallowed up by the dark veil of rain and wind. Her heart raced with every beat as she peered into the storm, trying to make out anything in the darkness. Then, just as she reached the bottom of the steps, something caught her eye. Movement. The outline of a figure against the dark. It was Max. The old dog was standing on the ground at the base of the porch, his body hunched with exhaustion. He was panting heavily, his fur damp and matted with rain, his eyes wide with something that Anna could only interpret as urgency. He wasn't just standing there. He was guarding something, protecting it with every ounce of his remaining strength. Anna knelt down, instinctively reaching for the dog, her fingers brushing against his wet coat. "Max, what's going on?" "What is it, boy?" she whispered, though she already had a sinking feeling she knew. The dog whined softly, pushing something forward with his nose, a small bundle that had been hidden from view. Anna gasped. There, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, was a baby. A tiny, helpless infant, its face pale from the cold, its body shivering uncontrollably. It was hard to tell whether it was a boy or a girl. The baby was so small, so delicate, and so cold. But there was no mistaking the fact that this little one had been abandoned in the middle of the storm, left alone, to die. Anna's heart clenched at the thought. Who would do such a thing? Who could leave an innocent child in these conditions? The baby's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Its tiny hands curled into fists. The bundle was barely moving, and Anna knew that if she didn't act quickly, it might not survive the storm. She gently picked up the baby, cradling it against her chest, feeling its small, fragile body tremble in the cold. Max, sensing her distress, gave her a soft nudge with his nose, as though silently urging her to hurry. "Come inside," Anna murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She stood, lifting the baby into her arms and stepping back toward the porch. Max followed closely behind, his tired legs stumbling slightly as he moved. The storm raged around them, but Anna couldn't afford to let the weather distract her. She was already in motion, moving quickly into the safety of her home. The warmth of the fire greeted her as she entered, and she wasted no time in settling the baby down on a soft pillow by the hearth. She wrapped the infant in a warm blanket, doing everything she could to restore some warmth to its frail body. Max, his duty fulfilled, collapsed onto the rug by the fireplace, his eyes closing as the warmth from the flames began to seep into his tired bones. Anna took a deep breath, looking down at the baby with a mixture of concern and wonder. How had this child come to be here? She couldn't fathom why someone would leave a helpless infant in the storm, and the mystery only deepened as she looked at the small embroidered initials stitched into the cloth. A.S. Anna's heart skipped a beat. The initials were unmistakable. A.S. Those initials were the same ones that had marked the belongings of her sister, Anna's estranged sibling who had disappeared years ago without a trace. Anna had never gotten an explanation for her sister's sudden departure, only the silent, unanswered questions that had lingered in the back of her mind. And now, staring at the initials, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place. Could this child be her niece? Could this baby, left in the care of an old dog who had wandered through the storm, be the child of the sister who had vanished? The thought was almost too much to comprehend. Her sister, who had been running from something, or someone, for so long. Anna had always suspected that her sister had been in some kind of trouble, but she had never known the details. The family had never known. And now, this baby, this tiny, vulnerable child, seemed to be the only living connection to a past that Anna had long tried to forget. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She gently stroked the baby's forehead, her mind racing. Why would her sister leave her child like this? Why would she abandon her own flesh and blood in the middle of a storm? The questions piled on top of one another, too many to untangle at once. And yet, one thing was certain. This baby had been left for dead, But thanks to Max, she was alive. Anna turned her gaze to the old dog lying by the fire, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. He had saved this child. Against all odds, Max had braved the storm, carrying the fragile life through the night to bring her here, to safety. Max had done what no one else could. He had brought the baby to Anna, and now it was up to her to figure out why. But one thing was for sure. This baby was not a stranger. This child was family, and Anna would protect her as fiercely as she had protected her own heart for all these years. Her sister's disappearance had never made sense, but now, with the baby in her arms and Max resting peacefully at her side, Anna knew that the search for answers was only beginning. Max's body trembled from exhaustion as he lay by the fire, the warmth of the flames a soothing balm to his aching bones. His eyelids fluttered closed, but his instincts remained sharp, alert to the sound of the baby's shallow breaths and Anna's anxious movements around the room. The storm outside had only worsened, and Anna, though grateful to be inside, knew that this was far from over. The winds howled louder with each passing minute, and the rain fell in torrential sheets, blurring the world outside. Anna sat near the fire, her gaze fixed on the child she had just taken in. She couldn't help but wonder how a baby, so fragile, so vulnerable, had ended up in the middle of this storm. Max had found her, sure, but now came the question. What was she supposed to do next? The authorities needed to be informed, of course, but there was something more pressing than that. There was something she had to figure out first. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: concern for the baby's well-being, fear of what her sister's disappearance meant, and dread of the uncertainty that lay ahead. But the most pressing concern in her heart was the safety of the child. The storm outside was not just a natural occurrence, it was a warning. It felt like more than just rain and wind. It felt like the world was telling her that time was running out. Max shifted restlessly by the fire, his head lifting slightly as he let out a low whine. Anna turned her head, locking eyes with the dog. There was something about the way he looked at her, calm, yet urgent. As if he knew something she didn't. As if he could sense that whatever had brought this baby to her wasn't over. She didn't need to be told. She knew instinctively. The storm was still out there, but the danger wasn't over. Something, someone, was coming. Anna stood up, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't wait for the authorities. The baby had already endured so much, and every moment counted. She had to move. Quickly. "Max, stay here with her," Anna instructed softly. But the dog was already on his feet, his tail wagging weakly, his ears perked up. There was no need to repeat the command. Max would stay. He always did. Anna hurried to the front door, peering through the narrow window in the wooden doorframe. The wind was so strong now that it felt like it could tear the door off its hinges. The trees outside bent at impossible angles, their leaves caught in the fierce gusts. The rain had turned into a fine mist, the kind that soaked through everything in an instant, and the thunder rumbled ominously, as though the sky itself were angry. But it wasn't the storm that made Anna's skin crawl. It was the darkness. The storm had cast the forest into near-total blackness, and the path to the village, though only a short distance away, felt impossibly far. She needed to find out where the baby had come from. She needed answers. But most of all, she had to protect this innocent child from whatever else was lurking out there. Max was already by her side as she reached for her coat. The dog, despite his age and the long trek he had endured earlier, had not faltered. He was her protector now, and she would not face this journey alone. "Come on, Max," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Let's go find out where she came from." Together, they stepped out into the storm, Anna's boots sinking into the thick mud as she pulled her coat tighter around her body. The cold hit her like a wall, biting through the layers of her clothing and chilling her to the bone. But it was the storm, the very elements themselves, that felt like the smallest of dangers compared to what lay ahead. As she walked, Max kept close by her side, his eyes scanning the dark forest around them. Anna's heart raced as they moved through the trees, the wind tearing at her hair, the rain whipping against her face. She could barely see anything in the darkness, but she trusted Max's instincts. He had always known the way, even when she didn't. There was a silent understanding between them, a bond that had formed over the past few hours, forged in the fire of shared purpose. He was her ally now, her protector, and nothing would keep them from uncovering the truth. As they trudged through the thickening mud, Anna's mind returned to the mystery of the baby's origins. A.S. The initials on the baby's blanket still lingered in her thoughts. Could it really be her sister's child? Could her sister, who had disappeared without a trace, leaving only a trail of unanswered questions, really have left her baby to die in the storm? No, that couldn't be right. Her sister wouldn't do that. Anna refused to believe it. But the evidence was there, and the more she thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Her sister had been running from something. Anna knew that much. But could it have been this bad? That she would leave her own child behind? Anna shivered, but not just from the cold. She couldn't deny the fear that twisted inside her. What if her sister had been forced into a situation so dire, so desperate, that abandoning her child had seemed like the only option? The thought was horrifying, but she couldn't dismiss it. There were far too many unknowns. Max paused suddenly, his ears twitching. Anna stopped in her tracks, holding her breath. The wind howled through the trees, but there was something else. Something in the air. Something that made her spine tingle with warning. A shadow moved in the distance. Anna's heart skipped a beat, and Max growled low in his throat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly turned her head, trying to discern the figure in the distance, but it was too dark, too quiet. The shadow moved again, slipping in and out of the trees like some elusive predator. Max tensed, his body rigid, and Anna instinctively took a step back. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she knew, without a doubt, that something was wrong. The storm had intensified, the winds roaring like a living thing, and Anna could barely make out the figure in the distance. Was it a person? Was it someone coming for the baby? Her mind raced through a dozen possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. But before she could make another move, the figure disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving her with only the terrifying knowledge that something, someone, was watching. The silence that followed was deafening. Anna and Max stood in the middle of the forest, the storm raging around them. The figure, whoever or whatever it was, had vanished into the dark, leaving only the echoes of its presence. The wind howled louder, whipping at Anna's face, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the spot where the shadow had been moments ago. The air around her felt thick, as though something were lingering just beyond the reach of the storm. Max remained perfectly still, his hackles raised and his body tense. His keen senses, honed by years of training and survival, were on high alert. Anna could feel his unease. She, too, had the distinct sense that they weren't alone anymore. She glanced at Max, his eyes locked on the darkened woods, his posture rigid with caution. His low growl rumbled in his chest, vibrating through the air like a warning. Slowly, Anna reached down and patted him on the head, her fingers trembling slightly from the chill in the air. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. She didn't believe her own words, not when she felt the growing weight of the danger surrounding them. Max didn't move. He stayed in place, his attention still fixed on the darkness. Anna swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. She couldn't afford to be scared. Not now. Not when the baby, the child they had saved, was in her care. But the shadow in the woods, something about it felt wrong. The presence was too sharp, too precise, as though someone, or something, was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Anna scanned the trees around them once more, but nothing moved. The storm, still furious, seemed to swallow the world whole. The forest was a void of swirling shadows and chaotic sounds, and every movement felt exaggerated, amplified by the fury of the weather. Max took a tentative step forward, sniffing the wet ground. He paused for a moment, sniffing the air, and then moved in a slow, deliberate direction. Anna followed, unable to leave him behind, her senses heightened by the strange atmosphere. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin out and the path to the village became more discernible, that Anna felt a sense of unease truly grow. The baby, wrapped in blankets, was still safe and warm, but Anna could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Something had happened here, and the questions she had been asking seemed to multiply by the minute. They had nearly reached the end of the forest when Max abruptly stopped, his body going still again. His ears perked up, and his low growl deepened into something more menacing. Anna's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to expect now. Had the shadow returned? Was there another danger, one they had failed to see until now? Max let out a sharp bark, a warning, and Anna instinctively pulled the baby closer to her chest, her hands tightening around the bundle of warmth. Her heart raced in her chest as her eyes flickered around the edge of the trees. And then, through the rain and mist, a figure appeared. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was a person. A tall man, cloaked in a dark, weathered coat, stood in the clearing ahead. He didn't move, didn't speak. But there was something about the way he stood, still, unwavering, that made Anna's breath catch in her throat. He was familiar, in a way that made her stomach turn. Her eyes narrowed. She'd seen this man before. But where? His face was obscured by the shadows of the night, his features just out of reach, but his presence was undeniably powerful. The same ominous feeling from earlier gripped her heart, but this time the source of that feeling stood right in front of her. Max growled again, his body rigid, and Anna instinctively took a step back. She wasn't sure who this man was, but she knew he wasn't here by accident. There was a purpose to his presence, something tied to the mystery of the baby. The man finally spoke, his voice cold, low, and almost too calm in contrast to the chaos around them. "You shouldn't have taken her," he said, his words cutting through the storm like a blade. Anna's breath caught. The recognition hit her like a wave. This man, this stranger, was connected to her sister. But how? And why had he followed them? The baby had barely been alive for a few hours, and yet, somehow, this man seemed to know exactly where to find her. "What do you mean?" Anna demanded, her voice rising, though it shook with uncertainty. She stepped forward, trying to put distance between the stranger and the baby, her protective instincts flaring up. Max, sensing her fear, stepped in front of her, a low growl vibrating in his throat. The man didn't flinch. Instead, his gaze flickered to the baby, his eyes narrowing with what could only be described as something between sorrow and anger. "She's not yours," he said, his voice tinged with something darker. "She was never meant to be saved." Anna's pulse quickened. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the cryptic words, trying to understand what he meant. The baby wasn't hers? What did that mean? Max's growl deepened into a snarl as the man took a step forward, his hands resting by his sides, not in any position of aggression, but still holding an undeniable threat. Anna could feel the tension between them. The wind seemed to whip harder now, and the rain began to fall heavier, blurring her vision. It was as though the world was closing in, suffocating her in its fury. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaky but fierce. She needed answers. She needed to know what this man knew, what he had to do with her sister, and why he was here now. The man remained silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and almost mournful. "My name is Elias," he said, as though that simple introduction held the weight of 1,000 untold stories. "And I'm the one who was supposed to protect her." Anna felt her blood run cold at the mention of the name. Elias? This man, who had been stalking the woods and now confronted her, was somehow connected to the mystery that had haunted her for years. The same mystery that had driven her sister away. The one that had led to her disappearance. And then, with a chilling sense of realization, the storm seemed to pause, the wind dying down just enough for Anna to hear the truth in his voice. The wind had died down, but the tension in the air was unbearable. Max continued to stand in front of Anna, his body a shield, his eyes fixed on Elias with a quiet ferocity. The storm seemed to retreat, though the dampness in the air and the occasional gusts reminded Anna that nature, much like the revelations unfolding before her, was far from predictable. Her mind was reeling. She'd come so far, found the baby, discovered its strange connection to her missing sister. But this man named Elias was a new and terrifying piece of the puzzle. He didn't seem like an enemy, not exactly. There was something in his gaze, something broken, something tormented, that made Anna hesitate. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her chest, crushing the breath from her lungs. "I was supposed to protect her," he had said, and the implications of that statement gnawed at Anna, leaving her with more questions than answers. Max's low growl rumbled once again, but Anna gently reached down, her hand resting on his neck. She could feel his muscles tense under her touch, but she needed him to stay calm. She needed him to help her through this moment. Elias watched her carefully, his eyes tracing her every movement, as if studying her. The silence stretched between them, suffocating, until Anna could no longer stand it. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Protect who?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady. "Who are you to the baby? What do you mean by protect her? What does this have to do with my sister?" Elias looked away for a moment, his eyes scanning the forest, as though searching for something, or someone, who might be lurking in the shadows. When his gaze returned to Anna, there was a sadness in his eyes, an emotion so raw that Anna almost felt herself falter. "I'm not here to harm her," Elias said, his voice low and calm. "But I am here to explain why she can never stay with you. Why you can't raise her, Anna." Anna's heart skipped a beat. Stay with me? The baby, her niece. She could hardly fathom the thought of losing her. But Elias's words held a terrifying finality. He didn't speak with anger, nor with malice. His voice was heavy with something else, something darker. "Why not?" Anna asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though it carried the weight of 1,000 questions. "What are you talking about?" Elias took a slow step forward, and Anna instinctively held the baby closer, as though her body alone could protect the child from whatever danger he represented. His eyes locked onto hers, and there was something in them, a pleading, a desperation, that struck Anna deep in her gut. "Because you don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his words darkening the air around them. "This baby, she's not just a child, she's a symbol, a key to something far bigger than you realize, something dangerous, something the world would never forgive." Max barked sharply, his growl escalating as he shifted, positioning himself closer to Anna. He could sense the unease building, and he was ready to protect her with everything he had. But Anna wasn't sure who or what needed protecting anymore. "What are you saying?" she demanded, feeling the icy grip of fear clutch at her chest. "What danger? Who's after her?" Elias seemed to hesitate, his lips parting as though he were about to speak, only to falter. For a moment, it felt like time itself had paused, holding its breath. Anna's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just about a missing child or an abandoned baby. There was something much deeper here. "I was part of a group," Elias finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were tasked with protecting her, keeping her safe from the very people who want to use her for their own gain." Anna's mind reeled, trying to process the words, but they were too much, too foreign. "A group?" she asked, her voice cracking with disbelief. "What do you mean, a group? Who would want to harm her?" Elias's gaze flickered briefly to the baby, his face filled with sorrow and regret. "There are people who would do anything to control what she is. She carries something inside her, something powerful. And there are those who would use her as a weapon, exploit her for their own purposes. She was never meant to be a normal child. She was always meant for something more, something dangerous." Anna's head spun, the implications of his words threatening to crush her. She looked down at the baby, whose tiny, innocent face was tucked into the blankets. How could someone so pure, so helpless, carry such weight? How could a baby be a symbol, a key to something so dark and terrible? Max growled again, and Elias's eyes darkened. "I don't want to hurt you, Anna," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "But you don't understand what you're up against. These people will stop at nothing to get what they want. And right now, she's the only thing standing between them and their goal." "Who are these people?" Anna demanded, her voice rising in fear. "What do they want with her? What's inside her?" Elias took a step closer, and Anna felt her heart race. She couldn't decide whether to trust him or run, but she knew she couldn't back down. Not now. "They're not human, Anna," Elias said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "They never were. And what they want, what they would do to her, it's beyond anything you could imagine. If they find her, they'll take her away. They'll use her. And there's nothing you or anyone else can do to stop it." Anna's mind struggled to make sense of his words. She wanted to believe he was lying, wanted to dismiss his warnings as the ranting of a madman. But the weight in his eyes, the seriousness of his tone, the very conviction with which he spoke, it was too much to ignore. And then it clicked. the initials on the baby's blanket, the strange connection to her sister, the urgency of Max's actions, the ominous figure of Elias. Everything had been leading to this moment. The baby wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was the target of something much darker, something Anna had never dreamed possible. The truth was finally beginning to sink in. The baby, the child she had fought so hard to protect, wasn't just a helpless orphan in need of a home. She was the key to something sinister, and the world was about to come crashing down on them all. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the air, heavy, oppressive, and filled with an unsettling stillness. Anna sat by the fire in her small, modest home, the baby, her niece, her responsibility now, sleeping soundly in her arms. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on the cool stone floor, his golden coat glistening softly in the dim light of the room. The dog had not left her side since the moment he had brought the child to her, and Anna found herself increasingly grateful for his quiet presence. She had never imagined a life like this, one where she would find herself caring for a child she never expected to raise, while grappling with the unexpected and inexplicable events that had unfolded around them. The reality of the situation still weighed heavily on her heart. Elias's words echoed in her mind, like a persistent echo reverberating through the walls of her thoughts. The baby, her niece, was the key to something dangerous, something larger than anything Anna could have ever imagined. She wasn't just an abandoned infant left on the side of the road. She was a piece of a puzzle, a target in a much bigger game. And while Anna had always believed in her own strength, this was a battle she hadn't been prepared for. Max, as if sensing her thoughts, shifted at her feet. His eyes met hers with a look that seemed almost understanding, as if telling her that everything would be okay, that he was here, and he would help her through whatever came next. The quiet bond between them had grown deeper over the past days, and Anna felt a sense of security in his presence. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment when she had found the baby, the moment when Max had appeared from the darkness of the storm, carrying the bundle so delicately in his mouth, like a lifeline thrown to her in the midst of a storm, both literal and figurative. The dog had shown nothing but determination, his eyes full of purpose, and though his body was old, his spirit had been unwavering. Max had become more than just a rescuer. He had become her protector, and, in a way, a piece of her family. The weeks that followed were filled with visits from the authorities, from doctors, and from others who had questions about the baby's origins, about the strange circumstances surrounding her abandonment. They were still no closer to discovering the truth about the mysterious group Elias had spoken of, or why the child was so important. But Anna didn't care for their investigations. She cared about the child in her arms. She cared about keeping her safe. And so, in the face of all this uncertainty, Anna made a decision. She was going to keep the baby. She was going to raise her. No matter what threats or dangers lay ahead, she would protect her niece. The child needed her now, and Anna had promised herself she would be the one to shield her from the world's darkness. Max, as if sensing Anna's resolve, stood and walked over to her side, his presence grounding her. The bond they shared had only deepened in the days since their perilous journey through the storm. Max had become a symbol of strength, of protection, and of unwavering loyalty. "Thank you, Max," Anna whispered, her voice catching in her throat as she stroked his head. The dog's warm, solid presence was a balm to her troubled heart. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Max wagged his tail in response, his eyes soft and full of affection. He had found his purpose once more. He wasn't just a stray dog, he was family. The following day, word began to spread through the village about the dog who had saved the child, about the miraculous bond between the two. People who had known Max before, when he was still a service dog, began to visit, offering their sympathy, their support, and sometimes even offers to adopt him. But Anna knew she couldn't part with him. She had learned so much from Max, about loyalty, about courage, about the depth of a bond that transcended words. He wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, a friend, a lifeline. And he had chosen her, just as she had chosen him. And so, Max became part of her family, and the house that had once felt empty, cold, and uncertain began to fill with warmth, laughter, and a sense of hope. The baby grew, as babies do, and Anna began to see glimpses of her personality emerge. A smile here, a soft giggle there, and the way her tiny hands reached out for Max whenever the dog came into the room. The child had begun to speak her first words, simple ones, like mama and dog. But it was the word that came one evening, in the quiet of the night, that filled Anna's heart with an unexpected sense of joy. As she sat beside the fire, Max resting at her feet and the baby cradled in her arms, the toddler looked up at the dog with wide eyes and said, in a voice that was both soft and certain, "Max." Anna blinked, stunned for a moment. Had she heard that correctly? The baby had said Max's name? The words were so simple, so pure, and yet they carried with them an overwhelming sense of connection. Max lifted his head from his paws and looked at the baby, his tail thumping softly against the floor in acknowledgement. The sound of the baby's first word sent a wave of emotion through Anna. She looked down at the child, her niece, her heart swelling with love. Max had become more than a hero. He had become a part of this little family, and now he was part of the child's world in a way Anna had never imagined. As she sat there, the fire crackling softly in the background, Anna felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The storm had passed, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she was no longer afraid. She had Max, and she had the child. They were a family now, broken, imperfect, but strong in their love and in their bond. And as the days passed, and the baby took her first steps, and Max continued to watch over them with the loyalty of a true protector, Anna couldn't help but feel that perhaps, in the end, it wasn't just the baby who had been saved that night in the storm. It was all of them, Max, Anna, and the child, finding healing, hope, and a second chance together. A full year passed, and in that time, Anna's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The small house she had once lived in quietly had become a lively home. The baby, now a lively toddler, had filled every corner with her giggles, her first words, and her curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Her name was Emma, and she had become the heart of Anna's world. Max, the loyal Labrador who had saved her life, had adapted to the new rhythm of their home with grace. He had grown older, but his presence was as steady and comforting as it had been when he first appeared at Anna's doorstep, carrying the fragile bundle of Emma in his mouth. He had become more than just a dog. He had become a protector, a companion, and a friend. And Anna, more than anything, had come to view him as family. They had built something together, something beautiful and imperfect, something that was theirs alone. Max still had his moments of weakness. He was getting older, and the weight of time was beginning to show in the way he moved, the slight stiffness in his joints. Yet, He remained ever vigilant, his senses still sharp, always aware of every movement, every sound. His devotion to Emma was unwavering, and he watched over her like a silent guardian, his eyes always tracking her movements, his ears pricked for any sign of danger. Emma, for her part, had grown to adore Max in a way that was pure and untainted by the complications of the world around them. From the moment she had learned to crawl, Max had been her constant companion. He would watch her with soft, patient eyes as she explored every corner of the house, his large frame always within reach. He was there when she took her first steps, steadying himself to catch her if she fell. And he was there when she babbled her first words, her tiny voice clear and full of wonder. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the soft glow of twilight filled the room, Anna sat on the worn armchair by the fireplace. Emma was playing on the floor, her small hands stacking colorful blocks into a wobbly tower, while Max lay nearby, his eyes half closed in contentment. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, and the sound of the crackling fire was the only noise in the room. Anna watched her niece with a heart full of gratitude. She thought back to the night she had found her, the night Max had saved them both. That moment felt like a lifetime ago now, a distant memory. Emma was no longer the fragile, helpless infant abandoned on the side of the road. She was a child full of life, full of questions, full of love. And Anna had become the mother she had never thought she would be. As she gazed at the scene before her, Emma playing and Max watching over her, Anna felt a deep sense of peace. It had taken time, but she had finally accepted the truth that had been unfolding since that stormy night. She was no longer alone. She had Emma, and she had Max. Together, they had created a family, one that had survived the darkest of storms and was now thriving in the warmth of love. Suddenly, Emma looked up from her blocks, her wide, innocent eyes locking onto Max. She wiggled her little fingers, as if calling the dog over, and then, in her soft, sing-song voice, she spoke two simple words. Max. The word hung in the air for a moment, and Anna's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time Emma had said his name. But this time, there was something different in the way she said it. A sense of recognition, of connection. Emma had known Max was important, even if she couldn't fully understand why. The bond between them had grown so strong, so natural, that it seemed impossible to imagine a life without it. Max's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and he raised his head, his eyes softening as they met Emma's gaze. With a low whine, he pushed himself to his feet, his old joints protesting the movement, but his devotion unwavering. Slowly, he made his way over to Emma, his tail wagging gently as she reached out to him with tiny arms. Anna watched as Max laid down beside Emma, his body relaxed but alert, always watchful. The toddler giggled and leaned against him, her tiny fingers brushing through his fur, and Max responded with a soft sigh, as if content to let her explore him at her own pace. The two of them, bound together by something deeper than either of them could understand, seemed to exist in a perfect moment of peace. Tears welled up in Anna's eyes as she watched them. It wasn't sadness that moved her, but a profound sense of love. In that moment, she realized just how much Max had given her, just how much he had become a part of their family. He had been there from the very beginning, guiding them, protecting them, and showing them that love could grow in the most unexpected places. Emma's laughter filled the room, and Max's tail thumped softly against the floor in response. Anna smiled through her tears, her heart full to the brim. This was her family. Broken in the beginning, yes, but now whole. She had found a new purpose in caring for Emma. And in turn, Emma had brought light into her life. And Max, the dog who had saved them both, had found his place beside them, proving that sometimes the most unlikely of heroes could become the most loyal of companions. As the fire crackled and the night settled in, Anna sat back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the window where the stars were beginning to appear. She had come a long way from the woman who had once been alone and uncertain. She had learned to trust, to love, and to open her heart to the unexpected gifts life had to offer. Max had shown her what it meant to protect, to give without asking for anything in return, and to love fiercely and unconditionally. He had given her a second chance at family, and in turn, she had given him a home, a place to belong. Together, they were more than they had ever been alone. Together, they were complete. As Emma's laughter echoed through the room once more, Anna whispered a quiet thank you to the universe for bringing them together, for the storm that had brought Max into her life, for the child who had taught her what it meant to be a mother, and for the dog who had never once faltered in his loyalty. Some heroes wore capes, but others had fur and four paws. And Anna, more than anyone, knew that heroes like Max were the ones who made life worth living.